Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The Consensus Question. Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith is frequently categorized as a tragic origin story, a spectacle-driven bridge between two disparate cinematic eras, or a cautionary tale about the seduction of absolute power. This consensus framing views the film as a predictable decline, a narrative inevitability where the hero succumbs to the villain's machinations. However, such a perspective overlooks the film's status as a sophisticated study of institutional decay and the inevitable collapse of consensus-based reality. The film serves as a visceral document of a society in the late stages of a democratic suicide, where the protagonist does not merely fall, but is systematically dismantled by a state apparatus that has successfully commodified both fear and salvation. The convergence of its claustrophobic digital architecture, the breakdown of epistemic trust, and the precise psychological manipulation of its lead character proves that Anakin Skywalker is not a fallen hero but a casualty of a grand, pre-programmed systemic collapse. The world of Revenge of the Sith is built upon a foundation of absolute bureaucratic exhaustion. The architecture, characterized by soaring, sterile towers of Coruscant and the metallic, industrial veins of separatist strongholds, visualizes a power structure that has become entirely untethered from the human experience. In this reality, the Jedi Order acts as an ideological state apparatus, tasked with maintaining a peace that exists only on the surface. The conflict is not between two moral poles but between two versions of authoritarian stability. Because the public's access to information is heavily mediated by Senate propaganda and the Jedi's own guarded exclusivity, the citizenry is starved of context, forced to live within a metanarrative of order that masks a deeper, structural rot. The film posits that when truth becomes consensus-based rather than empirical, the system loses its ability to self-correct, leaving the state ripe for the total consolidation of power by a single, pragmatic architect. Anakin Skywalker exists as the primary site of this structural failure. His trauma is not merely personal, it is institutional. Raised within a hierarchy that demands the suppression of emotional memory, his psychological landscape is a map of enforced dissociation. He is caught in a cycle of repetition where his greatest fear, the loss of life, is precisely what the system is incapable of preventing. The film masterfully traps him within a binary of rigid duty and frantic, possessive love, providing him with no vocabulary to process his trauma. Palpatine, functioning as the ultimate pragmatist, recognizes that he does not need to convert Anakin to a new ideology, he merely needs to offer him a mechanism to control his environment. Anakin's turn is the logical conclusion of a character who has been denied the capacity for healthy agency and instead offered the seductive promise of absolute control over his own reality. The craft of the film reflects this psychological disintegration through its aggressive use of digital density. The visual effects do not merely serve as background, they function as an oppressive force, dwarfing the characters and emphasizing their insignificance against the machine of the state. The lighting choices, particularly during the climactic duel on Mustafar, shift from the cold, artificial blues of political chamber interiors to a hellish, high-contrast chiaroscuro that strips away all pretense. The environment itself becomes an extension of the internal state, where the landscape is literally breaking apart as the social order collapses. The sound design complements this, creating a sonic environment where the silence of the Jedi's intellectual isolation is punctured by the industrial roar of war, effectively silencing the capacity for internal reflection. Ultimately, the film is a portrait of a predetermined end. The tragedy is not that Anakin chooses evil, but that the universe leaves him with no meaningful path toward a sustainable, individual existence. By the final frame, the transition from the Republic to the Empire is not a radical break from the past, but the inevitable solidification of the corruption already present in the opening act. The film leaves the viewer with the unsettling reality that the system survives the individual, it simply consumes their grief, their talent, and their soul to fuel its continued operation. Revenge of the Sith stands as a definitive exploration of how easily an entire reality can be manipulated once the infrastructure of truth has been successfully dismantled, leaving nothing behind but the cold, hard logic of the machine. The Subversion Question. Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith is frequently categorized as a tragic origin story, a melodrama centered on the inevitable fall of a hero misled by a master manipulator. However, this interpretation ignores the film's status as a clinical examination of institutional collapse. The consensus suggests Anakin Skywalker is a victim of external corruption, but the film's text demonstrates that he is the symptom of a hollowed-out republic that has already ceased to function as a democracy. The film serves as a brutal indictment of how political, religious, and social institutions commodify individuals to maintain the illusion of order, revealing that the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire are not opposing events, but the exact same process of administrative consolidation. The Republic depicted here is a shell, held together by the thin veneer of senatorial procedure and Jedi dogma. The economic reality is one of total war, where the citizenry exists merely as potential capital for either the separatist trade syndicates or the Republic's clone manufacturing juggernaut. Labor has been entirely abstracted. The clone army represents the ultimate commodification of human potential, where soldiers are grown, programmed, and discarded without social friction. The Jedi Order, acting as the state's enforcement arm, has failed to adapt to this reality, clinging to an ancient, ascetic mandate that prevents them from engaging with the actual needs of the populace. They exist in the ivory towers of the Coruscant Temple, physically isolated from the chaos of the lower levels, ensuring their epistemic failure. They do not know what the Republic is because they have stopped looking at anything other than the Force as a theological absolute. Anakin's psychological fracture is not a sudden corruption, it is a rational response to a system that demands absolute loyalty while offering him no actual agency. From the moment he enters the narrative, he is trapped in a feedback loop of trauma and repression. His internal monologue is silenced by the Jedi's insistence on attachment as a moral failing, forcing him to keep his marriage and his fears in a state of dissociative suspension. His core wound, the inability to control the death of those he loves, is exacerbated by a world that treats mortality as a logistical problem to be solved through political maneuvers. When he turns to Palpatine, he is not choosing evil, he is choosing the only figure in his life who acknowledges the validity of his desire for power as a tool for preservation. Palpatine functions as the perfect mirror of the Republic's own hypocrisy, openly wielding the pragmatism that the Jedi pretend does not exist. The film's visual language reinforces this sense of inevitability. The sheer scale of the CGI, with its sweeping vistas of Coruscant and massive, sterile ship interiors, reduces every character to a cog in a machine that is too large to dismantle. The lighting transition from the vibrant, high-contrast action of the opening battle to the claustrophobic, shadow-drenched corridors of the final confrontation tracks Anakin's descent into a state of total structural capture. By the time he stands on Mustafar, the visual space around him is dominated by industrial fire and volcanic ash, mirroring the destruction of his own internal landscape. He is no longer a human actor, he is a piece of hardware being refined in the crucible of state-sanctioned violence. Ultimately, Revenge of the Sith argues that the collapse was inevitable because the Republic never possessed a foundation of genuine liberty. It was a trade-based bureaucracy masquerading as a republic, and when the strain of war rendered that masquerade inefficient, the transition to authoritarianism was merely a technical update. The Jedi's failure is not that they were defeated by a Sith Lord, but that they allowed their moral code to become a tool for a system that prioritized order over human well-being. The film leaves the viewer with the cold realization that the hero's transformation into a monster is the most honest act in the entire story. Anakin Skywalker stops pretending that the system works, and in doing so, he becomes the necessary avatar for the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy that replaces it. The tragedy of the film is not the loss of a hero, but the revelation that the hero was always just a component waiting for a more efficient master. The anomaly question. Revenge of the Sith functions as a sophisticated meditation on the erosion of institutional memory and the tragic transformation of public service into private obsession. While often interpreted as a straightforward chronicle of a villain's origin, the film serves as a precise autopsy of how a republic consumes its own ideals to survive a perceived state of perpetual emergency. The film posits that democratic collapse is not merely the result of external malice but is the inevitable byproduct of an epistemic crisis, where the elite possess all the power to act yet lack the vocabulary to articulate their own moral decay. The narrative architecture is built upon a foundation of structural anxiety. The Jedi Order, acting as the state's self-appointed epistemological guardians, operates within a crumbling infrastructure of high modernist glass and steel that hides the rot within its own foundations. The visual language of Coruscant, an endless, crowded, and vertically stratified megalopolis, reinforces a sense of profound insignificance for the individual. Anakin Skywalker, the film's central figure, represents the collision between personal trauma and bureaucratic failure. His descent is not a sudden rupture but a systemic assimilation. The anomaly of his rapid moral pivot is, in truth, the film's most essential mechanism. His decision to betray the Jedi is the only logical conclusion within an environment where the state demands his absolute fealty while denying him the human necessity of grief. The film's philosophy finds its anchor in the irreconcilable tension between utilitarian governance and the emotional burden of the individual. The Jedi Council, blinded by their own adherence to a rigid, desensitized dogma, treat the human psyche as a variable to be managed rather than a consciousness to be nurtured. This is the catalyst for the tragedy. Anakin's turn to the dark side is a violent, desperate attempt to reclaim agency in a universe that views his love as an illicit commodity. The film argues that his fall is a rational, albeit destructive, response to the systemic starvation of the human spirit. He does not seek power for the sake of tyranny, he seeks the power to preserve life in a reality where the governing systems prioritize the preservation of the institution over the survival of the individual. Technically, the film employs digital cinematography and expansive CGI to externalize this internal fragmentation. The environments are vast, frictionless, and synthetic, serving to isolate the characters within their own anxieties. The visual rhythm of the film, characterized by fluid, sweeping camera movements, mirrors the inevitability of the path set for the protagonist. Even the most debated moments, such as the surreal, fire-drenched duels of the final act, exist as the culmination of the film's aesthetic shift toward a hellish, hyperrealized expression of trauma. The digital medium allows for a distortion of scale that renders the human figures infinitesimal, emphasizing their helplessness against the crushing weight of historical forces they helped set into motion. The tragedy of the film is found in its recursive nature. It functions as a closed loop where the characters, in their frantic attempts to avert disaster, solidify the very conditions of their own ruin. The Jedi attempt to suppress the shadow, as defined by Jung, only to manifest it in the person of Anakin Skywalker, who is the literal reflection of their own repressed pride and unacknowledged fear. By the final frame, the transition from the gleaming, antiseptic halls of the Republic to the claustrophobic, mask-bound reality of the Empire is complete. This shift illustrates a society that has traded the noise of fractured discourse for the suffocating silence of absolute order. The film concludes not with the defeat of a hero, but with the cold, inevitable realization that the individual is no match for a system that has fundamentally redefined the meaning of survival. The struggle to maintain one's humanity within an encroaching, synthetic, and hyper-monitored landscape remains the film's enduring, haunting thesis. The synthesis question. Star Wars, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith operates as a clinical documentation of institutional collapse, where the tragedy is not the fall of a hero, but the inevitability of a system that demands moral surrender in exchange for order. While the film is frequently viewed as a grand, operatic depiction of Anakin Skywalker's descent into villainy, this interpretation misses the structural engine driving that transformation. The film is a rigorous examination of how an epistemically fragile society, governed by dogmatic gatekeepers, creates the very shadow that eventually destroys it. The central anomaly of the film, the binary, near-total destruction of the Jedi Council and the Republic simultaneously, serves as the physical manifestation of a systemic death wish. My thesis is that Revenge of the Sith argues that totalizing systems of belief, when faced with an existential threat, prioritize the preservation of their own internal logic over the survival of the reality they are sworn to protect. The Jedi Order functions as the ultimate arbiter of truth, yet their authority is rooted in a rigid epistemology that renders them blind to the shift in the galaxy's reality. They maintain a monopoly on the Force, treating it as a stagnant commodity to be managed by an elite, monastic hierarchy. By the time of the film's inciting events, the Order is already hollowed out, existing as an ideological state apparatus that has replaced wisdom with procedure. Anakin Skywalker's psychological fracture is not merely a personal failure of temperament, it is a somatic response to the irreconcilable dissonance between the Jedi's stated narrative of peace and justice and the reality of a brutal, industrialized war that the Order is actively leading. The Council's demand that Anakin monitor Chancellor Palpatine is a tactical betrayal of their own moral code, placing him in a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance. This internal splitting, where he is forced to act as both a servant of the light and a spy for a corrupt political machine, destroys his capacity for autonomous identity. The visual language of the film reinforces this sense of entrapment. The cinematography relies heavily on high-contrast lighting and deep, synthetic environments, placing characters in vast, frictionless chambers where they appear dwarfed by the architecture of their own creation. The transition from the organic, sun-drenched environments of the earlier films to the increasingly metallic, shadowed, and artificial corridors of Coruscant reflects the alienation of the protagonist. As Anakin's psyche disintegrates, the visual effects, specifically the heavy use of digital layering and compositing, act as a barrier between his human consciousness and the external world. He is a man being consumed by his own interface, literally and figuratively, until his transformation into Darth Vader is not a sudden change, but a completion of a long-term erosion of the self. The antagonist, Palpatine, represents a cold, pragmatic logic that the Jedi are too intellectually insulated to perceive. He is not merely a villain, he is the inevitable conclusion of a world that has replaced genuine communal connection with institutional mandate. Palpatine understands that once a society is trained to prioritize obedience to a system over critical inquiry, it can be manipulated into celebrating its own enslavement. The Senate's applause upon the announcement of the Empire is the definitive visual proof of this. It is the moment the grand narrative of the Republic finally collapses, replaced by the hyperreality of a new, authoritarian status quo. The ethical dilemma presented in the film, particularly in the climactic confrontation, forces a choice between a failing, deontological adherence to rules and a utilitarian descent into catastrophic violence. The film posits that the Jedi's reliance on detachment, a forced repression of human intimacy, is the specific trauma that allows the Sith to gain purchase. When Anakin is finally given the absolute power he craves, it does not liberate him, it binds him to a cycle of destruction that mirrors his own internal wounding. The final image of the film, with Vader standing on the bridge of a Star Destroyer looking out at the skeletal remains of a nascent Death Star, confirms the thesis. The individual has been completely absorbed by the system, and the promise of peace has been realized through the total cessation of life and agency. The legacy of Revenge of the Sith remains in its chilling demonstration that when a society creates a vacuum where truth is managed by the powerful, the most efficient mechanism for filling that void is the totalizing, singular will of the tyrant. The collapse is complete, and the machine continues to function, perfected in its emptiness. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. Star Wars, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith functions as a sophisticated examination of institutional collapse, portraying the transformation of a democratic galactic order into an autocracy through the systematic erosion of truth and the monopolization of state violence. While frequently viewed through the lens of individual tragedy, the film is fundamentally a study of how a hyper-advanced civilization consumes its own foundations. The Galactic Republic operates on a currency of systemic stability, a fragile, bureaucratic consensus maintained by the Jedi Order, but the true commodity is the authority to define reality itself. The film illustrates a society where the official narrative is so thoroughly mediated by the state that the civilian population becomes functionally incapable of distinguishing a peaceful transition of power from the birth of a totalitarian regime. The world of the Republic is defined by an architectural and technological hierarchy that mirrors this political decay. The core worlds, represented by Coruscant, are hypermodern, frictionless environments where the elite navigate through vast, synthetic transit layers that isolate them from the physical reality of the surface. This vertical stratification serves as a visual indicator of power. Those at the top possess access to the highest tier of intelligence and governance, while the periphery is left to exist in a state of resource scarcity and localized conflict. The film establishes that the Republic's normal is a state of artificial comfort maintained by a massive, invisible infrastructure of droid labor and automated security. By outsourcing the physical labor of policing and war to synthetic, disposable entities, the political class detaches itself from the human cost of its legislative decisions. This commodification of combat, where armies are literally manufactured to resolve systemic friction, creates a dangerous vacuum where the human element is treated as an obsolete, irrational variable. In this environment, the Jedi Order acts as the primary gatekeeper of epistemological truth, holding a monopoly on the Force as an analytical tool. Yet, their reliance on dogma and archaic institutional structures blinds them to the shifting nature of the galaxy. The film presents the Republic not as a victim of external sabotage, but as a system collapsing inward under the weight of its own internal inconsistencies. The black market of the film is not one of physical goods, but of forbidden information and forbidden emotion. Because the Jedi mandate the repression of attachment and the suppression of the shadow self, they create a repressed psychic underground. Anakin Skywalker's fall is the inevitable result of this institutional failure. He is a character tasked with upholding a code that demands the total negation of his own trauma, forcing him to keep his most human vulnerabilities in a perpetual state of isolation. When the state, represented by Palpatine, offers him the vocabulary to process his pain, the Jedi's rigid, monolithic ideology offers him nothing but further alienation. The film visually reinforces this psychological fracturing through its masterful use of scale. Characters are frequently placed against vast, imposing digital vistas that emphasize their insignificance within the machinery of the state. The cinematography utilizes this depth to isolate protagonists, making their intimate, whispered conversations feel fragile within the metallic, sterile corridors of power. As the Republic transitions into the Empire, this visual language shifts toward a colder, more industrial aesthetic. The transition is marked by the replacement of organic, chaotic life with the rigid, geometric symmetry of the nascent Imperial Order. The final transformation of Anakin into Darth Vader is the ultimate act of physical commodification. The human body, broken by its failure to resolve the paradoxes of the system, is encased in armor that turns him into a permanent tool of the state. He ceases to be an individual with moral agency and becomes an extension of the system's architecture, a literal, breathing cog in the machinery of control. Ultimately, Revenge of the Sith depicts a society that trades its moral freedom for the promise of order. The irony of the film lies in the realization that the democratic structures of the Republic were already functioning as a de facto autocracy. The rise of the Empire is simply the moment the state stops pretending that the individual matters. The tragedy is not merely that a hero falls, but that the apparatus of the galaxy is designed to facilitate that fall. By the film's conclusion, the transition is complete. The rhetoric of peace and security has been successfully weaponized to justify the total surrender of the citizenry. The film presents a chillingly prescient portrait of how information, technological superiority, and the abandonment of critical discourse converge to ensure that even a world-spanning civilization can be led into the darkness by its own established leadership, leaving the individual to navigate the ruins of a reality they no longer recognize. Architecture and the visual geography. Revenge of the Sith functions as a grand architectural tragedy where the disintegration of democracy is written directly into the film's visual geography. The Republic, far from a stable utopia, exists as a hyperstratified urban expanse that visually communicates its own inevitable collapse. Coruscant serves as the ultimate expression of this power structure, where the Jedi Temple stands as a singular, imposing fortress of rigid geometry, floating above a cityscape of infinite, layered verticality. This architectural hierarchy reinforces the distance between the monastic, ivory tower elites and the sprawling, unseen masses below, establishing a world where the highest echelons of authority have physically detached themselves from the organic reality of the populace. The production design meticulously contrasts the cold, synthetic precision of the Republic's central hubs with the creeping encroachment of chaos. The Senate chambers, with their frictionless, floating pods and sterile, circular symmetry, represent the absolute zenith of institutional order. Yet, this design is inherently brittle. The architecture relies on absolute centralized control, creating a landscape that feels increasingly suffocating as the film progresses. As Palpatine's influence grows, the visual language shifts from the aspirational, clean lines of the Jedi Temple to the oppressive, industrial shadows of his private office. This office acts as a microcosm of the entire society, dark, ornate, and suffocatingly enclosed, suggesting that the golden age of the Republic is already an exercise in ruinous maintenance rather than genuine progress. The film utilizes its visual scale to render the individual completely insignificant against the crushing weight of the system. Wide, sweeping shots of Coruscant, achieved through massive digital set extensions, emphasize a world that is far too vast for any single person to navigate or govern effectively. Characters move through this space not as agents of change, but as small figures drifting through frictionless, corporate transit lanes. Whether gliding in high-speed transports or navigating the cavernous, impersonal halls of the Senate, the protagonists are perpetually framed by massive, inhuman geometries that suggest their efforts to preserve the status quo are being swallowed by the sheer scope of the machine they serve. Nature in this world exists only as a curated, ornamental remnant. The lush, vibrant landscapes of Kashyyyk or the volcanic, hellish expanse of Mustafar serve as binary opposites that define the limits of this technological hegemony. On Coruscant, the organic is entirely subordinated to the artificial, represented by the manicured gardens of the Senate or the private, synthetic sunset of the Chancellor's quarters. The film positions technology as the primary architect of reality, where digital structures have replaced the environment entirely. By the time the action shifts to the scorched, industrial landscape of Mustafar, the visual geography mirrors the total psychological breakdown of the protagonist. The environment is no longer a site of governance or civilization, but a raw, primordial battlefield of lava and metal that strips away the pretenses of the Republic's polished architecture. The VFX of scale functions as a narrative device to heighten the inevitability of the collapse. The film's reliance on deep compositing and procedural city generation allows for a visual rhythm that feels relentless and unyielding. The camera movements are precise, gliding with a detached, omniscient authority that tracks the characters through their own obsolescence. As the Republic transitions into the Empire, the architecture shifts into a sharper, more militant aesthetic. The sleek, rounded surfaces of the Republic are slowly replaced by the stark, brutalist angles of the coming regime. This transition is not a sudden disruption but a natural evolution of a system that has already abandoned its humanitarian foundations. The architecture of Revenge of the Sith does not merely house the characters, it dictates the boundaries of their morality, demonstrating that when a society builds itself into a state of total structural isolation, the individual's path toward catastrophe becomes the only logical outcome of their environment. Epistemology, information, and society. Revenge of the Sith functions as a sophisticated study of epistemic collapse, presenting a galaxy where reality is entirely contingent upon the mediation of information. The film operates within a political environment where truth is not an objective constant but a curated resource managed by those with the authority to command narratives. At the outset, the Jedi Order acts as the primary epistemological gatekeeper, relying on a rigid, traditionalist framework of intuition and ancient doctrine to perceive the universe. This system, however, fails because it is entirely insulated from the shifting data patterns of the Galactic Republic. The Jedi perceive reality through a filter of self-assured righteousness, effectively blinding them to the pragmatic machinations of Palpatine, who operates by flooding the information sphere with calculated contradictions and manufactured crises. The propaganda engine in this reality is pervasive and highly efficient. Palpatine utilizes the apparatus of the state to transform democratic discourse into a tool for consolidation. By positioning himself as the singular protector of a system currently under siege, he forces the citizenry and the Senate into a state of cognitive dissonance where the suspension of civil liberties is rebranded as a necessary defense of liberty itself. The film illustrates that when a society is saturated with state-sanctioned noise, individual actors lose the ability to verify truth through lived experience. Instead, they rely on the meta-narrative provided by the leadership. The Jedi Order, despite their immense power, are ultimately outmaneuvered because they attempt to apply a static moral philosophy to a society that has transitioned into a post-truth, hyper-mediated landscape where the loudest narrative dictates the laws of physics. Anakin Skywalker's descent serves as the microcosm for this larger epistemic failure. His transition to the dark side is fundamentally a rejection of the Jedi's mediated reality in favor of a new, seductive certainty offered by Palpatine. Because he is starved of context regarding his own trauma and is isolated from genuine emotional support, he becomes desperate for an epistemology that provides immediate, actionable results rather than abstract wisdom. Palpatine replaces the Jedi silence, which Anakin perceives as a lack of care, with a flood of validating, albeit deceptive, information. The Sith Lord constructs a reality for Anakin where the Jedi are not guardians, but usurpers. By controlling the flow of information, Palpatine dictates the boundaries of Anakin's world, successfully narrowing his perspective until the only truth left is the one that serves his own rage and fear. The visual geography of the film reinforces this theme of managed reality. Coruscant is depicted as a sprawling, hyper-connected nexus where every surface is a screen or a conduit for communication. the high-level corridors where the political elite congregate are frictionless, sterile, and bathed in artificial light, signaling an environment where history and truth can be easily polished or erased. Conversely, the outskirts and the industrial zones, such as the lava-drenched landscapes of Mustafar, represent the violent, raw reality that exists outside of the propaganda machine. When characters move from the gleaming, curated centers of power to these desolate, hazardous margins, they are forced to confront truths that the official narrative obscures. The finality of the film, marked by the destruction of the Jedi archives and the systematic reorganization of the state, signifies the total monopolization of knowledge. By the final frame, the Republic has ceased to exist as a consensus-based democracy, replaced by an empire predicated on a singular, mandated history. The triumph of the Sith is not merely a military victory, it is an epistemological one, ensuring that for the vast majority of the galaxy, the lie becomes the only accessible version of the truth. Anakin is the ultimate casualty of this shift, as his sense of self is hollowed out and replaced by a pre-programmed persona, cementing the idea that within this system, the individual is effectively erased the moment they concede their perception of reality to the state. Friction, Law, and the Catalyst. Star Wars, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith functions as a rigorous anatomical study of institutional failure and the subsequent collapse of the individual moral compass. While popular discourse often frames the film as a space opera concerning the rise of a dictator, the narrative is more accurately characterized as an examination of how bureaucratic stagnation creates a vacuum that necessitates authoritarian intervention. The Galactic Republic is not merely a setting but a moribund political entity, defined by its reliance on an unsustainable judicial and legislative model. The Jedi Order, acting as the state's enforcement mechanism, serves as an ideological apparatus that has lost the ability to distinguish between its own dogmatic survival and the actual well-being of the citizens it is sworn to protect. This systemic failure provides the necessary friction for the catalyst of Anakin Skywalker's descent. He is not a victim of individual manipulation alone, but a product of an environment that demands absolute compliance while offering no tangible path for emotional or moral resolution. The economic and political reality of the Republic is one of terminal decline, where corporate interests, represented by the Techno-Union and the banking clan, have already eclipsed the legislative authority of the Senate. In this world, the Jedi represent the final tier of gatekeeping, maintaining a monopoly on the Force to preserve an order that has become spiritually and politically hollow. This creates a baseline of misery for the populace, who are subjected to a constant state of low-level war, effectively turning the galaxy into a resource for extraction rather than a society of growth. When the state relies on the violent suppression of rebellion, justice ceases to be about rehabilitation or social equity and instead becomes a tool for mathematical value extraction, the total removal of threats to the existing order. Anakin Skywalker exists at the intersection of this systemic rot. His trajectory is dictated by a profound epistemic fracture. He is trained to believe he is a guardian of peace, yet his daily reality requires him to function as a soldier in a war of attrition. The Jedi Council serves as the ultimate arbiter of truth, yet their refusal to acknowledge the internal human elements of love, grief, and fear creates a cognitive dissonance that Anakin cannot resolve. He is trapped by a language that is fundamentally unable to process his lived experience. The Council offers only stoicism and detachment as a cure for his trauma, while Chancellor Palpatine offers a pragmatic, albeit nihilistic, acknowledgement of his potential. Palpatine, functioning as the manifestation of Anakin's own repressed shadow, validates the individual's desire for power as a means to achieve stability in a chaotic, collapsing system. Visually, the film reinforces this sense of entrapment through its architecture and digital landscape. The environments shift from the sleek, high-altitude corporate spaces of Coruscant to the claustrophobic, volcanic intensity of Mustafar. The use of dense CGI and extensive digital compositing serves to isolate characters within their environments, illustrating their insignificance against the scale of the collapsing Republic. Even the lightsaber combat, often analyzed merely as action, functions here as a somatic expression of emotional trauma. Every movement, particularly in the climactic confrontation between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin, is heavy with the weight of lost history and broken trust. The characters move through these spaces not as agents of free will, but as cogs caught in a deterministic feedback loop, where their attempts to maintain the status quo directly accelerate the final catastrophe. The film's philosophical weight lies in its rejection of traditional heroism in favor of an exploration of the ethics of necessity. Anakin's fall is an active construction of his own meaning in a universe that has failed to provide one. He adopts the logic of the antagonist because it provides a clear, actionable path, whereas the Jedi remain paralyzed by the burden of an outdated moral calculus. This moral pivot point, the moment where the protagonist decides that the survival of the individual is worth the destruction of the collective, serves as the definitive sociological catalyst for the transformation from Republic to Empire. Ultimately, Revenge of the Sith presents the inevitability of collapse as a consequence of ideological rigidity. The system breaks down from within, crushed by the weight of its own unsustainable, performative governance. By the film's final frame, the transition to the new order is complete, but the emotional landscape remains one of profound, unresolved loss. The film concludes with the synthesis of the personal and the political, the destruction of the individual ego and the rise of a new, synthetic identity. This is not a story of a hero becoming a villain, but an observation of how a failing, hyper-mediated society consumes the people tasked with preserving it, leaving behind only the cold, sterile architecture of a power structure that no longer answers to any authority other than its own survival. The film succeeds in proving that when the state abandons its duty to the human spirit, the resulting void is not just a political shift, but a fundamental tearing of the fabric of reality itself. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. Revenge of the Sith functions as a profound meditation on the disintegration of the self under the weight of an unsustainable ideological metanarrative. The protagonist, Anakin Skywalker, is trapped within a rigid, monastic structure that demands the total suppression of personal attachment, forcing him to construct a fabricated ego centered on the identity of the Chosen One. This identity acts as a psychic anchor, promising that his extraordinary capabilities entitle him to transcend the common limitations of human loss and biological fragility. However, this ego is inherently fragile because it is contingent upon his continued service to a Jedi Order that equates emotional detachment with moral superiority. The epistemic fracture occurs precisely when Anakin confronts Palpatine in the Opera House. As the Chancellor reveals his identity as a Sith Lord, the structural reality of the Jedi Order, a system built on the premise that power must be checked by asceticism, collapses. In this moment, Anakin's foundational understanding of the world is invalidated. He discovers that his binary morality, which casts the Jedi as the sole custodians of truth, is a convenient fiction maintained by the Republic's political machinery. His reaction is not immediate rebellion but a terrifying, dissociative paralysis. He realizes that the authority figures he trusted are not arbiters of cosmic truth but tactical players in a game of imperial consolidation. This realization forces a violent collision between his internal desire for autonomy and the restrictive language of his programming. Anakin possesses no vocabulary for his grief or his ambition. The Jedi philosophy provides only the language of attachment as a pejorative, leaving him unable to articulate his need for connection without framing it as a failure of character. Consequently, he exists in a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance, where his actions, such as the execution of Count Dooku, violently contradict his vows as a protector of life. He justifies these transgressions through a utilitarian calculus, convincing himself that he is performing necessary evils to secure a greater peace, effectively mimicking the very political logic of the Chancellor he serves. As he descends into the shadow, Anakin mirrors the transformation of the state itself. The Republic's shift into the Empire is a physical manifestation of his own psyche, where the chaos of a democratic, fragmented internal life is forcibly reorganized into the orderly, monolithic structure of tyranny. The film demonstrates that when a person is deprived of the tools to process trauma, they will inevitably seek the most efficient, albeit destructive, structure to contain their suffering. Anakin's decision to embrace the dark side is an attempt to escape the agony of uncertainty. By surrendering to the absolute authority of the Sith, he trades the burden of individual conscience for the certainty of the machine. The somatic reality of this transformation is equally telling. Anakin's body becomes a site of constant negotiation between flesh and augmentation. As he loses parts of himself to combat, he replaces them with mechanical hardware, physically embodying his shift from a feeling human subject to a programmed instrument of the state. This is not merely a loss of limbs, but a literal shedding of the human capacity for vulnerability. By the time he stands on Mustafar, the fabrication of his ego is complete. He believes he has brought peace, justice, and security to his new empire, a declaration that serves as the final barrier against the crushing reality of his choices. The tragedy of Revenge of the Sith is that Anakin's path to self-actualization requires the absolute annihilation of the person he once was, proving that in a world governed by totalizing ideologies, the cost of absolute certainty is the soul itself. Trauma and somatic experiencing. Revenge of the Sith functions as a visceral study of trauma and the somatic disintegration of the self. Anakin Skywalker's descent is not merely a political shift, it is a profound rupture in his physical and psychological identity, rooted in the foundational wound of his separation from his mother and his subsequent inability to protect the women in his life. This core wound remains hidden behind the facade of the Jedi Knight, a curated, performative masculinity, until the third act, when the loss of Padme becomes the absolute catalyst for the abandonment of his humanity. The film meticulously tracks how this trauma is stored within the body, manifesting as a form of somatic memory that dictates his actions long before he consciously chooses a side. Anakin's body functions as a site of intense emotional pressure, evidenced by his kinetic, restless combat style and his frequent, involuntary clutching of his mechanical hand. This prosthesis serves as a constant, nagging reminder of his failure and his lack of control. As the film progresses, his relationship with his own physicality shifts from viewing his body as a Jedi instrument to regarding it as a failing vessel that requires total augmentation. The transition from flesh to the black armor of Darth Vader is the ultimate culmination of this rejection of the biological self. He treats his own skin as an obstacle to be discarded, eventually embracing the synthetic, cold efficiency of life support hardware to suppress the pain he can no longer process. Anakin's behavior is defined by a repetitive compulsion to regain agency through force, an attempt to master the chaos of his history. Every violent act he commits is a subconscious reenactment of his past helplessness, transposed onto new victims in a futile bid for dominion. He is caught in a cycle where he believes that by achieving absolute power, he can prevent the recurrence of the grief that defined his youth. This mechanism is profoundly avoidant. He dissociates from the moral reality of his crimes by framing them as necessary, logical steps toward a superior, ordered existence. The film visually reinforces this psychological breakdown through the staging of his environment. In the early stages of the film, Anakin is often framed within expansive, golden-lit spaces that emphasize his status, yet as his internal fractures widen, the framing becomes increasingly claustrophobic and saturated with unnatural, synthetic light. The scene on Mustafar represents the final destruction of his ego, where the volcanic environment functions as an extension of his internal volatility. His final transformation is not a choice made in a vacuum, but the inevitable consequence of a character who has been physically and mentally hollowed out by the refusal to acknowledge the grief stored in his own cells. When the mask finally descends, the sound design emphasizes his labored, rhythmic breathing, a mechanical replacement for the heartbeat of the man he was. This moment serves as the final visual proof of his internal collapse, the total erasure of the individual in favor of a programmed, systematized entity designed solely to survive the trauma that ultimately consumed him. The Shadow and the Antagonist. Revenge of the Sith functions as an intimate autopsy of a collapsing psyche, where the antagonist serves as the externalized manifestation of the protagonist's shadow. Anakin Skywalker's descent is not a sudden rupture but a methodical alignment with the Palpatine-ordained worldview. Palpatine operates as a master of pragmatism, framing his authoritarian rise as a logical, necessary response to the systemic paralysis of the Jedi Order and the Republic. By situating his dark ambition within the language of order, security, and the preservation of those he loves, Palpatine validates Anakin's own repressed fears. The Emperor represents the absolute, uninhibited version of the power Anakin seeks, functioning as a mirror that reflects the protagonist's internal belief that traditional moral constraints are merely obstacles to his desired agency. The film meticulously constructs a mirror dynamic through the divergent paths of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. Both men occupy the same structural position within the Jedi hierarchy, yet their responses to institutional failure diverge entirely. Obi-Wan exemplifies the discipline of self-renunciation, choosing to uphold the collective oath even as the framework that demands it begins to crumble. Conversely, Anakin views his position as a restrictive cage, projecting his internal resentment onto the Jedi Council. He perceives his mentor's caution as active hostility, unfairly accusing them of suppressing his potential to ensure their own dominance. This projection allows him to rationalize his shift toward the shadow. He convinces himself that his betrayal is a preemptive strike against an oppressive system that has already abandoned him. Central to this tragedy is the parasitic nature of the relationship between the master and the apprentice. Palpatine feeds exclusively upon Anakin's emotional and physical capital, extracting his loyalty, his talent, and ultimately his humanity to fuel the ascent of the Empire. The relationship is a one-way consumption, where every expression of Anakin's love for Padme or his desire for protection is transmuted into raw fuel for Palpatine's machinations. Anakin does not recognize this predation because he has become conditioned to view his own identity through the prism of his utility. He defines his worth solely by the power he wields, a metric Palpatine carefully cultivates. Consequently, the protagonist's psychological trajectory is characterized by an increasing detachment from his own moral foundations. He justifies the sacrifice of his peers as an inevitable byproduct of his pursuit of greater truths. The film frames this transformation as an inevitable collapse of the ego under the weight of its own unvoiced desires. Anakin's trauma, the fear of loss and the impotence of his own abilities, creates a psychological vacuum that Palpatine is uniquely positioned to fill. The antagonist does not force Anakin into evil, rather, he provides a structured, logical, and tempting alternative to the Jedi's epistemic ambiguity. By offering clarity where the Jedi offer only dogma, Palpatine weaponizes Anakin's need for certainty. The resulting transition into the shadow is total, as the protagonist abandons the performative role of the hero for the cold, efficient reality of the Sith. This shift represents the ultimate maturation of his repressed traits, where the desire to control outcomes transcends the value of life itself. The film presents this not as a tragedy of malice, but as a fatal failure of integration. Anakin fails to reconcile his shadow, and in doing so, allows it to consume the remainder of his personhood. The resulting figure, Darth Vader, is the personification of a human being who has surrendered his agency to the very system he once claimed he would reform, completing his descent into the absolute void of a predetermined, authoritarian reality. The visual proof of the psyche. Revenge of the Sith functions as a sophisticated clinical study of psychological dissolution, presenting the transformation of Anakin Skywalker not as a sudden deviation, but as the inevitable result of systemic entrapment and internalized trauma. The film posits that when an individual exists within a rigid, bureaucratic framework that demands the total suppression of personal attachment, the resulting internal fracture is eventually projected outward, manifesting as the destruction of the very institutions that mandated such restraint. The central argument of the film is that the Jedi Order's prohibition of emotional vulnerability creates a vacuum of intimacy that Palpatine exploits, turning the character's greatest strength, his capacity for profound love, into the singular catalyst for his descent into authoritarianism. This collapse of the self is visually encoded through the constant interplay between Anakin and his environment. Throughout the film, the production design uses massive, synthetic digital landscapes, from the soaring, sterile vistas of Coruscant to the claustrophobic, volcanic topography of Mustafar, to underscore the protagonist's increasing insignificance. Anakin is perpetually dwarfed by the architecture of the Republic and the Jedi Temple, suggesting a man who has lost his agency to a system that views him as a tool of prophecy rather than a human being. The visual isolation is achieved through dense compositing that places the character in environments where the scale of the world is perpetually misaligned with his internal turmoil. Even in intimate spaces, such as his shared quarters with Padme, the light is often artificial, filtered through screens and metallic surfaces, reinforcing the notion that his private life is a contraband existence, disconnected from the organic reality he yearns to protect. The tragedy is articulated through Anakin's somatic experience of his own morality. His trauma is stored not merely in memory, but in his mechanical augmentations. His cybernetic hand serves as a constant, tangible reminder of his past failures and his inability to reconcile his flesh with his duties. As the narrative progresses, his movements become increasingly rigid, reflecting a man who has replaced genuine emotional processing with the programmed behavior of an enforcer. He adopts the performative language of the Jedi Council to maintain the facade of a hero, yet his discourse reveals an underlying epistemic fracture. He no longer trusts the information provided by the Masters, turning instead to the seductive, hyperreal narrative spun by Palpatine. Palpatine operates as the perfect Jungian shadow, mirroring Anakin's deepest insecurities and validating his desire for absolute control, thereby transforming Anakin's private fear of loss into a public mandate for order. The film's philosophical weight rests on the failure of the Jedi's deontological moral framework. By insisting that attachment is inherently dangerous, the Order deprives Anakin of the tools necessary to navigate his anxiety, leaving him vulnerable to a utilitarian logic that permits any atrocity in the service of a desired outcome. The character's breaking point is visually and orally signaled when he abandons the soft, ambient hum of the Jedi library for the aggressive, industrial clatter of the volcanic landscape. The final transformation is marked by the destruction of his previous identity. As he is fitted into the suit, the film captures the absolute erasure of his humanity. The final image of the suit, standing on the deck of a Star Destroyer, represents the triumph of the machine over the psyche. The ego is fully subsumed by the system he helped create, and the individual is extinguished, replaced by a purely functional, cold, and reactionary force. In this context, Revenge of the Sith functions as an indictment of any ideology that demands the sacrifice of the human experience for the maintenance of a status quo. The film argues that once the personal cost of loyalty becomes too high, the individual will inevitably recoil against the authority that demanded it, seeking to rewrite the rules of reality to accommodate their own trauma. The tragedy is that in his desperate search for a way to save the one person who recognizes his humanity, Anakin inadvertently destroys the reality in which that love could exist. The film remains a masterful exploration of how a life constrained by the demands of others eventually erupts into a total rejection of the world, leaving the protagonist caught in an eternal, self-perpetuating loop of power, loneliness, and regret. By the time the screen fades to black, the system has successfully absorbed the rebel and rendered him an instrument of its own continued, terrifying existence. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. Revenge of the Sith functions as a profound meditation on the collapse of epistemological security within a decaying state. At the heart of the narrative lies the radical instability of truth, where the Jedi Order, once the unimpeachable arbiters of moral and objective reality, find themselves adrift in a post-truth landscape. The film posits that the boundaries of the characters' world are defined strictly by the limitations of their discursive frameworks. The Jedi rely upon a dogmatic language of detachment and absolute clarity, a vocabulary that proves fundamentally inadequate for capturing the nuanced, shifting tides of human desire and political manipulation. When Chancellor Palpatine begins his systematic deconstruction of the Republic's grand narrative, he does so by weaponizing language itself, replacing the Jedi's rigid, monolithic definitions of the Force and peace with an elastic, utilitarian rhetoric that prioritizes order over righteousness. This transition from an era of consensus-based truth to one of manufactured perception highlights the vulnerability of a society that anchors its security in a single, institutional perspective. Anakin Skywalker represents the site of this total epistemic failure. His descent is not merely a moral collapse but a cognitive one. He is forced to navigate a reality where his fundamental understanding of the self, as a hero, a protector, and a Jedi, is systematically invalidated by the very figures he trusts to define it. As the Jedi Council retreats into the secrecy of their own bureaucracy, their epistemic authority wanes, replaced by the seductive, clarifying simplicity of Palpatine's discourse. The Chancellor acts as the ultimate architect of this new reality, proving that in a hyper-connected, high-stakes galactic environment, whoever controls the narrative arc ultimately governs the physical world. The film underscores the danger of living within a linguistic cage. The Jedi represent the Wittgensteinian limitation where their world is defined by a strictly curated language of duty, leaving them blind to the existential threats that thrive in the shadows of that vocabulary. They possess no conceptual tools to process the emotional volatility of a human subject like Anakin because their philosophy demands the suppression of the very humanity they seek to protect. Consequently, their discourse becomes a hollow shell, a relic of a golden age that no longer exists, while Palpatine exploits the discrepancy between the Jedi's high-minded rhetoric and the messy, violent reality of galactic politics. He maneuvers Anakin into a space where the traditional definitions of Jedi and Sith cease to function as meaningful moral descriptors, replacing them with a purely instrumental logic focused on the preservation of power. This erosion of truth is visually and thematically mirrored in the transformation of the Republic into the Empire. The transition is not simply a change in governance but a fundamental shift in how truth is mediated for the citizenry. The official history of the Republic, once taught as an objective, sacred timeline, is discarded in favor of a reality predicated on power and necessity. The film illustrates that when truth becomes subject to the will of the hegemon, the citizenry is inevitably starved of context, drowning in a sea of conflicting propaganda and manufactured crises. The Jedi, caught in their own cognitive dissonance, are unable to reconcile their static understanding of a cosmic order with the dynamic, chaotic truth of Palpatine's machinations. They remain trapped in a circular, self-defeating logic that ensures their own obsolescence. Ultimately, the tragedy of the film is that the characters are denied any objective ground upon which to stand. Reality becomes a sensory and intellectual illusion, shaped by the pervasive influence of those who master the art of discourse. By the time the mask is placed upon Vader, the old world, a world defined by the Jedi's singular, noble language, has been utterly liquidated. The survivors are left to inhabit a new reality where the very concept of objective morality has been abandoned. The film leaves the viewer with the unsettling realization that reality is always a malleable construct, constantly being redefined by those who command the language of power. The struggle for the soul of the character becomes a struggle to define what is real, a battle that Anakin eventually loses when he surrenders his own capacity to question the narrative being whispered into his ear. In this environment, truth is not something to be discovered, but something to be enforced by the victor of the discursive war. Metanarratives and social theory. Star Wars, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith functions as a definitive study on the catastrophic collapse of a grand narrative, illustrating how the institutional pillars of a republic are dismantled not by external conquest, but by the rot of internal ideological contradictions. At the heart of the film is the failure of the Jedi Order's foundational belief system, which centers on a detached, ascetic humanism that proves insufficient to address the encroaching darkness of a political system transitioning into authoritarianism. The film portrays the Jedi not as failed warriors, but as figures trapped within an ideological state apparatus that demands total emotional repression and the abandonment of personal agency. By enforcing a dogma that requires the negation of human connection, specifically through the prohibition of love, the Order creates a psychological vacuum that the burgeoning Empire, under Palpatine's influence, expertly fills. This institutional failure is inextricably linked to the film's depiction of hyperreality, where symbols, titles, and political spectacle have entirely superseded substantive governance. Chancellor Palpatine masterfully manipulates the public perception of the Republic, utilizing the veneer of democratic procedure to enact the total dissolution of liberty. The citizens of the galaxy consume the state's manufactured history and propaganda, participating in a social contract that has already become hollowed out. Information in this reality is processed through the prism of political necessity, ensuring that the shift from republic to empire occurs with the active, or at least complicit, applause of the legislative body. The film posits that once the language of freedom is co-opted by the architect of its destruction, the population becomes untethered from the truth, rendering their consensus reality a dangerous fiction. Anakin Skywalker serves as the ultimate casualty of this system, his descent into the shadow of the Sith representing the violent rejection of a failing, contradictory ideology. His psychological trajectory is defined by a desperate search for meaning within a framework that offers him only duty and fear. When he attempts to break the structural constraints of his existence, specifically by seeking a way to prevent the death of his wife, he finds that the institutional power of the Jedi offers no solution to the fundamental reality of human suffering. In his isolation, he becomes a mirror of the society around him, adopting the pragmatic, cold logic of Palpatine, who promises the only tangible agency available, the power to influence life and death. Anakin's turn is an act of rebellion against the impotence of the Jedi Order, yet this rebellion is immediately commodified and weaponized by the very system he aims to escape. The film operates within a cyclical, self-correcting feedback loop of tragedy, wherein Anakin's efforts to ensure his own future and the survival of his loved ones directly precipitate the destruction of everything he holds dear. This is the ultimate expression of cybernetic control, as his choices are perfectly anticipated and utilized by the antagonist to close the loop on the Republic's collapse. There is no escape from this deterministic trajectory because the individual, regardless of their innate power, remains a cog within a socio-political machine that demands the sacrifice of the self for the sake of the structural hierarchy. Visually, this collapse is mirrored in the transition from the bustling, vibrant architecture of the mid-republic to the stark, industrial, and oppressive aesthetic of the nascent empire. The cinematography emphasizes the dwarfing of the individual against the massive, looming scale of the state's monolithic structures. The transition is completed in the final sequence, where the organic, warm hues of the Jedi Temple give way to the cold, sterile, and metallic environment of the suit that traps the remains of Anakin Skywalker. This transformation serves as the final, brutal realization of the film's thesis: when the grand narrative of a society fails and is replaced by the pursuit of absolute power, the individual loses their humanity to become a tool of the regime they helped create. Revenge of the Sith concludes not with a hopeful horizon, but with the chilling finality of a system that has successfully consumed its own potential for change, leaving only the rigid, unchanging architecture of total control. The tragedy lies in the recognition that the characters, constrained by their own traumas and the failures of their institutions, were mathematically destined to complete the cycle that brings about their own collective obsolescence. Ethics and the moral calculus. Revenge of the Sith serves as an intricate examination of the breakdown of objective moral systems when faced with the volatile subjectivity of human desire. At its core, the film functions as a tragic exploration of the trolley problem, where the protagonist, Anakin Skywalker, shifts from a deontological framework, where duty to the Jedi Code is absolute, to a radical form of utilitarianism. His descent is not a departure from morality, but rather a narrow, desperate recalibration of it. He justifies the abandonment of his ethical constraints by arguing that the survival of his spouse, Padme, outweighs the abstract preservation of galactic peace or the institutional integrity of the Jedi Order. By prioritizing the life of the individual over the welfare of the collective, he effectively adopts the same ends-based logic he once sought to eradicate, illustrating that when the greater good is redefined by personal loss, moral systems become tools for justification rather than guides for behavior. This shift underscores the film's inquiry into the morality of the non-human and the nature of personhood. The Republic's reliance on the clone army, a collective of genetically engineered, sentient beings stripped of individual agency, highlights a profound ethical failing. The Jedi, who ostensibly represent the moral height of the civilization, treat these clones as expendable infrastructure, yet they lament the loss of their own autonomy when Anakin falls to the dark side. The film posits that personhood in this universe is ironically dependent on the state's recognition of one's right to choose. When Anakin aligns his will with Palpatine, he ceases to be a knight serving a moral mandate and becomes an instrument of a new, synthetic order. His transformation into a cyborg is the ultimate physical manifestation of this moral depletion. By replacing his organic form with mechanical components, he completes his transition into the ultimate utilitarian object, functioning with ruthless, pre-programmed efficiency. The tragedy of this arc is rooted in the absence of a meaningful revolt against an oppressive system. Anakin faces an absurd universe where the Jedi Council represents a rigid, dogmatic institution that fails to provide him with the emotional vocabulary to process his trauma. Instead of confronting this inherent meaninglessness or constructing a new framework for existence, he surrenders to the nihilistic vision offered by Palpatine. This surrender is framed not as a loss of power, but as the achievement of absolute agency. He mistakes his liberation from the Jedi Code for total freedom, failing to realize he has merely swapped one set of chains for another. The ideological alignment between the master and apprentice is absolute. They share a belief that order is the only valid ethical goal, and that any violence committed in the name of that order is fundamentally righteous. The film further scrutinizes the ethics of ignorance through the lens of the political elite. Characters like Bail Organa and the remaining Jedi are forced to navigate a landscape of carefully curated truth, where the democratic apparatus is utilized to systematically dismantle democracy. The audience observes the precise moment when the truth becomes secondary to the stability of the state, as the Republic willingly ignores the warning signs of tyranny in favor of the comfort provided by a strong, centralized authority. This choice, to remain willfully blind to the encroaching corruption, proves as destructive as the overt violence committed by the Sith. The film contends that the refusal to engage with the uncomfortable reality of power's consolidation is a terminal moral failure. By the time the facade finally crumbles, the institutional structures intended to protect the citizens have already been converted into engines of their subjugation, leaving the survivors to exist in a post-truth reality where their past ideals are relegated to forgotten myths. Anakin's ultimate transformation is the catalyst that renders these internal contradictions permanent, cementing a status quo where the ends always justify the violent, machine-like means. Determinism, agency, and time. Revenge of the Sith functions as a rigorous examination of the collapse of human agency under the weight of an inescapable structural determinism. The film portrays the fall of Anakin Skywalker not as a sudden deviation from his path, but as the inevitable completion of a programmed trajectory. From the opening sequence, the galaxy is presented as a closed system governed by ancient, immutable forces and a rigid hierarchy that leaves no room for genuine individual deviation. The narrative posits that when characters believe they are exercising free will, they are merely fulfilling their function within a preordained cycle of institutional rise and fall. The Jedi Order and the Republic serve as the primary ideological state apparatuses, demanding absolute conformity to a set of dogmatic prescriptions that prioritize the preservation of the system over the flourishing of the individual. Anakin's internal struggle manifests as a confrontation with the limits of this language. He lacks the vocabulary to articulate his trauma, his fear of loss and his resentment toward his mentors, because the Jedi philosophy explicitly forbids the existence of these emotions. This epistemic limitation forces him into a state of cognitive dissonance, where his actions must eventually contradict his stated identity as a servant of peace to satisfy his deeper, repressed needs. He becomes a prisoner of his own internal architecture, acting out a role he was cast in long before he understood the parameters of the tragedy. Palpatine, serving as the master architect of this deterministic reality, weaponizes the Jedi's own moral calculus against them. By positioning himself as the only entity capable of offering a solution to the finite nature of life, he exploits the very human desire for control that the Jedi attempt to suppress. Anakin's choice to turn toward the Sith is the moment he finally accepts his own lack of autonomy. He trades the illusion of the Chosen One, a grand narrative of destiny that offers him status but denies him humanity, for the dark power of the Sith, which promises, albeit falsely, a dominion over reality itself. In this transition, he moves from a pawn of the light to an agent of a new, absolute structure. The film visually reinforces this sense of entrapment through its spatial architecture and technical execution. The massive digital environments of Coruscant and Mustafar dwarf the characters, rendering them as small, frantic figures lost in colossal, synthetic landscapes. The reliance on sweeping, artificial camera movements further strips the characters of their status as free agents, as they appear to be guided by the invisible hand of the director, moving through settings that feel designed to contain them. The heavy integration of digital effects and the glossy, hyperreal quality of the frame mirror the loss of the organic self. Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader is the literal physical realization of this process, where his flesh is replaced by the cold, immutable hardware of a life support system. He becomes a literal component of the machine he helped create. Ultimately, the film presents a bleak synthesis regarding the individual's place within history. The collapse of the Republic is not a temporary failure of policy, but the logical conclusion of a system that demanded total sacrifice from its participants. Anakin's final moments in the suit represent the total erasure of the individual beneath the weight of his own historical necessity. The tragedy lies in the realization that his struggle to prevent death only accelerated the machinery of destruction. In the closing sequence, as the twin suns set on a galaxy entering a long, dark epoch, the film asserts that the individual is but a transient signal in a larger, relentless loop of power. The struggle is not in the capacity to change the outcome, but in the harrowing awareness that one is entirely powerless to stop the descent, leaving the viewer with a portrait of existence where the burden of choice is ultimately revealed to be an existential fiction. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. Revenge of the Sith functions as a masterclass in digital architecture, where the cinematography and spatial language are meticulously calibrated to mirror Anakin Skywalker's descent into moral and psychological fragmentation. The film establishes a visual hierarchy that systematically diminishes the individual, utilizing camera movement and framing to transition from the relative stability of the Jedi Order to the claustrophobic, manufactured reality of the burgeoning Empire. In the early acts, the camera assumes the role of an objective, omniscient observer, employing smooth, sweeping crane shots that glide through the sprawling, interconnected geography of Coruscant. This fluidity suggests a society that is functional, orderly, and transparent. As the narrative progresses, however, the camera's behavior shifts to reflect Anakin's internal instability. Handheld sequences and aggressive reframing during his confrontations with the Jedi Council signal the disruption of the established order. By the time the action descends to the volcanic hellscape of Mustafar, the cinematography adopts an erratic, predatory quality, effectively stripping the characters of their status as heroes and reducing them to kinetic, conflicting forces within an environment that is intentionally hostile and oppressive. The production design utilizes depth and negative space to communicate the profound isolation of its protagonist. Anakin is frequently framed against immense, empty digital vistas, such as the vast skyline of Coruscant or the overwhelming horizon of the Mustafarian lava rivers, which serve to highlight his insignificance against the crushing weight of systemic change. This spatial strategy forces the viewer to confront the paradox of the Chosen One. The more powerful Anakin believes he is becoming, the smaller he appears within the frame. When he resides in the high-ceilinged, sterile chambers of the Jedi Temple, he is physically dominated by the architecture of tradition, represented by sharp, unforgiving lines and cold lighting. As he moves toward the influence of Palpatine, the environment shifts into warm, shadowed, and ornate spaces, suggesting a transition from the light of institutional logic to the seductive, intimate entrapment of the dark side. Color palette architecture plays a pivotal role in signaling the collapse of the character's psyche. The film begins with vibrant, saturated tones, the gold of the Republic's transit lanes and the cool blues of the Jedi's aesthetic, which represent the baseline of a secure reality. As Anakin's perception of truth begins to fracture, the color grading gradually leans into high-contrast chiaroscuro, utilizing deep, encroaching shadows that swallow the figures on screen. By the climax, the color palette is dominated by the harsh, monochromatic extremes of lava orange and ash gray. This shift is not merely aesthetic, it is a visual manifestation of the death of the Jedi ideal. The lighting becomes increasingly directional and harsh, casting long, distorted shadows that visually articulate the manifestation of Anakin's Jungian shadow self. The integration of CGI serves as an extension of this spatial language, creating a world that feels increasingly artificial as the protagonist loses touch with his moral compass. The film's reliance on digital set extensions allows for impossible geographies, cities that wrap around the screen and landscapes that defy traditional physics, which reinforces the idea that the characters are living in a fabricated reality. The technical precision of these environments contrasts sharply with the raw, emotional performances, creating a localized version of the uncanny valley. The characters occupy a space that is technically perfect yet emotionally hollow, mirroring their inability to distinguish between genuine loyalty and the performative nature of their political roles. The film's visual language is ultimately one of structural collapse. By utilizing a camera that transitions from the observant to the intrusive, and environments that transition from the architectural to the chaotic, Revenge of the Sith creates a cinematic experience where the visual craft itself dictates the inevitability of the tragedy, proving that the destruction of a soul is as much a matter of spatial displacement as it is of moral choice. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. Revenge of the Sith functions as a digital tapestry where the boundary between organic performance and synthetic environment is intentionally dissolved to mirror the protagonist's own dissociation. The film's heavy reliance on early to mid-2000s computer-generated imagery creates a hyper-stylized reality that serves as a visual metaphor for the sterile, high-functioning machinery of the Galactic Republic. By saturating the frame with digital artifice, the production design forces the audience to inhabit a space where the tactile world is being systematically replaced by a cold, computational order. The integration of the synthetic elements demonstrates a rigorous commitment to maintaining consistent luminosity and color temperature across disparate layers of production. In sequences like the Battle of Coruscant, the film achieves a high degree of technical synergy by matching the intense, artificial glow of plasma fire and cockpit reflections with the practical light hitting the actors. This consistency ensures that the characters appear firmly rooted within the digital environments, preventing the audience from perceiving the VFX as a shallow overlay. Rather than allowing the digital elements to float or drift, the compositing process prioritizes black levels and shadow density to anchor the performances within the high-contrast aesthetic of the film, reinforcing the idea that the characters are effectively trapped within a pervasive, all-encompassing system. The physics of the digital objects in Revenge of the Sith prioritize weight and kinetic impact to satisfy the internal logic of the world. When mechanical structures collapse or starships execute high-speed maneuvers, the physics engine driving these simulations emphasizes gravity and resistance. The heaviness conveyed through the debris, the momentum of crashing vessels, and the visceral recoil of lightsaber collisions provides a sense of tangible stakes. This weight ensures that the action remains grounded, demanding that the viewer perceive these digital events as authentic catastrophes rather than weightless abstractions. By maintaining a strict adherence to these established physical rules, the film grants its synthetic world the authority of objective reality, making the collapse of the social order feel as physically destructive as the architectural disintegration shown on screen. The film makes extensive use of invisible VFX to construct its expansive sense of scale. Beyond the obvious space battles and alien landscapes, there exists a vast layer of subtle, quiet effects, including comprehensive set extensions, complex sky replacements, and sophisticated crowd multiplication, that function as the architectural foundation of the film. These invisible touches manipulate the geography of the set, effectively transforming intimate sound stages into sprawling, multi-layered urban environments. This technique allows for a level of visual complexity that would be impossible with traditional sets, effectively selling the vast, impersonal nature of the galaxy. By seamlessly weaving these extensions into the background, the production design forces the viewer to accept the scale of the system as an inescapable, omnipresent reality. The aesthetic of the film reflects a conscious decision to favor maximalist visual density, utilizing the full capacity of available digital tools to create a world of vibrant, saturated, and highly textured environments. This choice creates a specific look defined by deep detail and complex lighting schemas, elevating the visual presentation to a level that emphasizes the grandiosity and technical sophistication of the era being depicted. The digital artistry functions as an extension of the Republic's own facade, a society that projects absolute perfection and controlled beauty even as it teeters on the brink of collapse. The richness of these environments suggests a civilization at the zenith of its power, where the cost of maintaining such a polished, synthetic reality is a totalizing loss of individual nuance. Ultimately, the technical execution in Revenge of the Sith serves to externalize the psychological arc of its central characters. The synthetic nature of the world creates a feedback loop where the characters are visually forced to conform to the cold, rigid, and high-gloss environments they inhabit. By committing fully to a heavily digital aesthetic, the film ensures that the transition from a vibrant, albeit synthetic, democracy to the stark, mechanical tyranny of the Empire is visually coherent. The craft of the film does not merely support the narrative, it provides the essential, artificial structure within which the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker must occur, proving that the loss of the human soul is an inevitable result of living within a reality that has become entirely and unyieldingly digitized. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. The sensory architecture of Revenge of the Sith functions as a sophisticated apparatus of psychological erosion, where the boundary between the external environment and the protagonist's internal decay is intentionally dissolved. By manipulating the sonic environment and the rhythm of the edit, the film forces the viewer to inhabit Anakin Skywalker's fracturing psyche, moving from the cacophony of an expansive, hyper-industrialized galactic war to the suffocating silence of total existential isolation. The sound design in this film serves as a precise indicator of psychological state, utilizing a dense, layered soundscape to mirror Anakin's loss of agency. In the opening sequences above Coruscant, the audio is overwhelming, characterized by a constant stream of aggressive mechanical hums, screeching starfighter engines, and the rhythmic percussion of blaster fire. This noise floor represents a world that is loud, demanding, and utterly indifferent to the individual. As Anakin's trauma deepens, however, the mix shifts, the chaotic background of the galaxy begins to bleed into the non-diegetic score, effectively erasing the divide between his environment and his mental distress. The heavy, low-frequency brass motifs of John Williams' score often meld with the deep vibrations of cityscapes and ship engines, suggesting that the very technology Anakin relies upon is becoming an inescapable extension of his own anxiety. Rhythm and editing operate in tandem with these sonic cues to dictate the pace of the character's degradation. The film's editing rhythm accelerates during moments of high-stakes conflict, utilizing rapid-fire cuts that mimic the erratic, impulsive nature of a mind trapped in a feedback loop of fear and rage. This increased velocity in the cutting pattern creates a sensory overload that prevents the audience from resting, forcing a shared experience of the desperation Anakin feels as his options dwindle. Conversely, the film masterfully utilizes silence as a weapon of profound emotional weight. During the pivotal confrontation on Mustafar, the soundscape transitions from the explosive, lava-filled environment to a chilling, localized silence that emphasizes the finality of the Jedi Order's collapse. By stripping away the ambient noise of the volcanic planet at the moment of betrayal, the film isolates the dialogue, lending an air of clinical coldness to the violence. The audio perspective is equally deliberate in its tethering to the protagonist's shift toward total ego collapse. In moments of extreme vulnerability, such as Anakin's private meditations or his interactions with Palpatine, the atmospheric noise of the world is aggressively dampened, creating a vacuum that centers the viewer entirely within his shifting consciousness. This technique forces the audience to confront the fabrication of the ego, as the silence highlights the disconnect between what is said and the visceral, often dissonant, truth of the character's actions. The mechanical breathing introduced in the film's conclusion represents the final synthesis of the sonic landscape, a rhythmic, repetitive, and synthesized sound that replaces the organic volatility of his earlier environment. This auditory motif is both the sound of his survival and the sound of his imprisonment, marking the completion of the film's technical journey from a world of infinite, noisy possibility to one of singular, machine-dictated purpose. Through this intricate interplay of sound and tempo, the film ensures that the audience does not merely watch the tragedy, they process the sensory dismantling of a human soul in real time. Synthesis of craft. Revenge of the Sith functions as a digital tapestry where the technical execution acts as the primary architect of Anakin Skywalker's descent. The film embraces the high-definition potential of the digital medium, utilizing a crisp, pervasive clarity that strips away the romantic haze of traditional film stock to expose the cold, synthetic reality of a collapsing republic. This visual sharpness serves a specific narrative function. It forces the audience into an unflinching intimacy with the protagonist's deteriorating psyche. By favoring long focal lengths, the cinematography compresses space, creating an environment where characters are visually isolated from their backgrounds, reinforcing their profound sense of alienation even within the crowded, bustling chambers of Coruscant. The choreography of the frame frequently utilizes fluid, sweeping camera movements that function as a sentient observer, documenting the inevitability of the Jedi Order's demise. These long, unblinking takes refuse to offer the characters a moment of reprieve, tracking their movements through vast, geometrically perfect environments that emphasize their insignificance. When the camera glides through the expansive, sterile corridors of the Senate, it highlights a world where human agency is systematically dwarfed by the architectural machinery of the state. This movement is never erratic or accidental, it is a calculated, godlike perspective that mirrors the cold, predetermined nature of the tragedy unfolding within the frame. Lighting serves as the most potent psychological tool in the film's visual arsenal, particularly through a sophisticated application of chiaroscuro. As Anakin moves closer to the dark side, his environment shifts from the balanced, warm palettes of the Jedi Temple to high-contrast environments dominated by deep, encroaching shadows. This use of light is not merely atmospheric, it is a literal manifestation of the Jungian shadow. The light sources in the film, often emanating from unnatural, flickering holographic displays or the hellish glow of Mustafar, serve to divide the characters' faces, highlighting the split between their public, performative selves and the corrupted reality festering beneath the surface. The darkness is not an absence of light, but an active participant that consumes the frame, reflecting the internal reclamation of Anakin's identity by his repressed trauma. The technical brilliance of the film's VFX and set extensions reaches its philosophical zenith in the final transformation sequence. The assembly of Darth Vader is perhaps the most technically impressive shot of the entire saga because it is the point where the film's narrative stakes and technical execution perfectly align. The cold, mechanical process of welding plate armor onto biological tissue serves as a brutal technical metaphor for the film's central thesis, the replacement of human spirit with technological artifice. As the digital mask descends onto Anakin's face, the film uses the limitations of the medium to signify the death of the individual. The CGI is not just a spectacle of scale, it is an instrument of erasure, transforming a once vibrant human protagonist into a static, functional node within a larger, authoritarian system. By refusing to soften the digital texture of the image, the film underscores the artificiality of the reality the characters inhabit. The reliance on blue screen and digital composition creates an uncanny, hyperreal aesthetic that feels fundamentally detached from the natural world. This stylistic choice is essential to the film's argument. The characters are trapped in a simulation of order that is rapidly breaking down. Every pixelated horizon and shimmering cityscape reinforces the idea that this society is a construct maintained by propaganda and institutional inertia. When the technical facade begins to flicker or distort during moments of intense emotional conflict, it perfectly mirrors the fracture of the character's own epistemological foundations. Through this synthesis of craft, the film demands that the viewer recognize the collapse not merely as a historical event within a fictional timeline, but as a systematic failure of a reality that has prioritized technological control over the complexities of the human soul. The final frames, which abandon the vibrant, chaotic beauty of the galaxy for the singular, oppressive focus of a mechanical breathing apparatus, confirm that the medium and the message have become one, a totalizing, inescapable structure of steel, shadow, and cold, unyielding light. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Revenge of the Sith functions as the definitive cinematic bridge between the optimism of institutional idealism and the cold, mechanical reality of totalitarian control. The film concludes with a recursive loop that reinforces the tragic inevitability of its central character arc. The final image of a sunset on Tatooine mirrors the first film's hopeful horizon, yet the context has shifted from a promise of adventure to a desperate act of preservation. Anakin Skywalker's descent into the metallic shell of Darth Vader is the ultimate expression of the film's preoccupation with the body as a commodity. By replacing organic tissue with machine components, the film illustrates the physical manifestation of an ideological transformation. The individual is not merely corrupted, they are systematically repurposed into a tool for the state, rendering the final form of the antagonist a chilling monument to the death of human agency. The film serves as a precise cultural mirror for the early 2000s, reflecting a socio-political landscape defined by the erosion of democratic institutions in the name of security. It articulates the anxiety of a society that perceives its governing bodies as stagnant and chooses to trade systemic freedom for the perceived stability of a single, decisive authority. The Chancellor's rise to power through the manipulation of a manufactured war acts as a scathing critique of statecraft, demonstrating how legislative processes can be dismantled from within when the populace is effectively paralyzed by fear. This narrative choice highlights how truth becomes a malleable construct, subordinate to the propaganda engine of a rising regime. Technically, the film stands as a vanguard of digital environmental storytelling. By pushing the boundaries of CGI to create sprawling, synthetic worlds, the filmmakers successfully externalize the internal psychological fragmentation of the protagonists. The sheer density of the VFX, the shimmering, saturated expanse of Coruscant or the hellish, volcanic topography of Mustafar, creates a sense of scale that renders the human individual insignificant against the backdrop of historical shifts. Future filmmakers look to this work as a foundational moment for digital cinematography, where the seamless integration of high-key lighting with complex, synthetic geometry established a new visual language for high fantasy epics. The technical risk taken here, an all-encompassing digital aesthetic, demands that the viewer treat the film's reality as a hyperreal construct, further emphasizing the theme of life under a fabricated, artificial order. The film leaves an unresolved tension in the aftermath of the Jedi Order's collapse. While the conflict between the light and dark sides of the Force reaches a violent climax, the question of whether a system built on dogmatic control can ever truly foster individual liberation remains hanging in the air. This gap is intentional. It denies the audience a clean moral resolution, forcing them to sit with the reality that the good side of the struggle was often just as intellectually rigid and emotionally unavailable as the forces that destroyed it. The narrative offers no catharsis, choosing instead to close on a note of permanent, structural loss. The final metaphor of the film is found in the contrast between the organic infancy of the twins and the cold, unyielding mask of Vader. It is a striking visual binary that summarizes the entirety of the work. The fragile, fleeting potential of the individual remains trapped in the shadow of a monolithic, unfeeling system. By ending exactly where the cycle begins, the film ensures that the struggle is not merely a historical event, but a warning regarding the fragility of institutions. It demands that the viewer recognize the signs of ideological rot long before the final transformation occurs, proving that the greatest tragedies are those that are entirely preventable, yet mathematically destined by the compromises of those in power.